Is there an employment bomb about to detonate the housing market? That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. If you're new to the channel, welcome aboard. My name is Chris Igoe. If you're a returning viewer, I appreciate your participation in our journey. And the catalyst for today's video was a phone call that I received from a friend of mine who is in the real estate space. And while he's not a residential realtor, he is an architect, he is a structural engineer, he is boots on the ground, and he's got his hands in the pot of all kinds of different aspects of the real estate market. Which is a long way of saying he is very well versed and he knows what he's talking about as it relates to different housing market dynamics. And he shared with me that he is completely slammed and overwhelmed with work, mainly due to Senate Bill 4D, which is some new legislation in the Senate, which is about to be passed, which will change the requirements for most buildings, most condos that exist within Florida. And without getting too detailed or too granular here, I'll give you a 5,000-foot overview. But I'm also sure many of you remember the condo that fell apart, imploded, and killed or hurt a lot of people down in Miami because it wasn't structurally sound. And without doing any finger pointing as to who's to blame, because right now there's no value in that, the state, the legislature, wants to ensure that that never happens again. And so they changed the rules. So in the past, the way it worked was a condo, a building, had a 40-year inspection. And in addition to that, there were also rules as it relates to the amount of capital they must have on hand for repairs, improvements, and structural upgrades. But as evidenced by the fact that the building fell down, those rules, that legislation was not up to speed and needed to be revised. It needed a fresh set of eyes, and it needed to ensure that that would not happen again in the future. And with that, we've got Senate Bill 4D, which is in the process of being passed. And what it now requires is much higher capitalization and much more frequent inspections. And while there are many buildings and many condos that are in front of that legislation, that are well capitalized, that are structurally sound, where the board, the members, the residents are in front of all of the legislation because they want to ensure that they are safe, they are secure, they are not at risk financially, physically, or any other way. But it's not universally true throughout the state of Florida. So there are plenty of buildings that are not where they should be as it relates to many things. And many of those buildings are completely underfunded, and many of those buildings will not pass an inspection. But in some instances, those inspections aren't for, at least based on the old rules, another 10, 20, 30, or 40 years, which is no bueno if you live in one of those buildings. Which brings me back to my conversation with him. And he was sharing with me the inspections that he's doing on some of these buildings, and he's completely blown away by how underfunded and ill-prepared many of these buildings throughout the state are. Now, obviously, I'm not sharing this to alarm you in any way, shape, or form, but if you are out there thinking about buying a condo, you must do a lot of due diligence to fully understand what it is you're buying, what the condition of the building is that you're moving into, what the capitalization is for that building. Do they have the funds and do they have the resources to be compliant and for you to be safe? And the good news is, if you're shopping for a condo and you're working with a professional that understands these things, they know the questions to ask to ensure that you are safe and you have done your due diligence. But make no mistake, throughout the state of Florida, there are lots of buildings that aren't even close to being up to code, that aren't even close to being up to what this new legislation is. And I share that because if these buildings and these condo associations, if they can't bring the building up to code, if they can't bring their capital reserves to where they need to be within a year, I believe it's a year, then the people who live there will be displaced until they are compliant and they've checked all the boxes that they must check in order for everyone to be safe. Now, one thing I can tell you for certain, as someone who lives in an HOA, the last thing that I ever want to get is an assessment from my HOA. The last thing I ever want to get from my HOA is an increase in my monthly dues. Now, in my particular community, I think we have a very fair HOA fee and we get a tremendous amount of value for what we're paying for. But I've certainly also experienced other communities that are horribly run that have exorbitant fees. They don't really offer much value, which is not an indictment on any particular neighborhood. I'm just calling it like I see it. And the one thing I know for certain is that nobody wants a bigger bill. Nobody wants an assessment. Nobody wants to spend money that they don't have. And right now we are in the process of going through a recession, starting to feel economic pain. And the last thing that anyone's going to want to experience over the course of the next year or two or longer is a bigger bill they must pay or they will be displaced. Nobody wants that. Well, that's not exactly true. I can tell you who does want that. The smart money, the big money, the investors that exist out there, the institutional buyers, I can promise you they are chomping at the bit waiting for these things to happen so they can go out there, purchase those buildings, knock those puppies down, and build brand new ultra luxury properties, which they can charge a fortune for. Because the one thing that you cannot recreate is oceanfront land, which will always trade at a premium. But it's certainly going to trade at a much higher premium if it is a brand new building, which is ultra modern, ultra luxury, and ultra safe. And right now, there are a lot of opportunistic shoppers that are sitting on the sideline with tons of cash waiting to deploy it into distressed assets that will deserve premium valuation when the market does what the market does. And when we ride out the storm of whatever this next recession looks like. But make no mistake, cash seeks its highest value, and scarce land, oceanfront land, premium land will be gobbled up by investors, period, end of story, all day long. I don't care what's going on in the economy, and I don't care what's going on in any market. There is a ton of smart money sitting on the sidelines, just like Warren Buffett, just like Charlie Munger, just like Berkshire Hathaway, sitting on the sidelines waiting for the right opportunity in order to go in and buy aggressively. That's absolutely going to happen. Now, I kind of went down a wormhole there because that was not exactly what I wanted to talk about today. The reason I started making this video is when my friend called me, the question that he asked me had nothing to do with real estate, and it certainly had nothing to do with Senate Bill 4D. It had to do with Ron DeSantis. Actually, I'm getting my story a little bit out of order, but to maintain the integrity of the actual conversation rather than me telling a story, it didn't start with Ron DeSantis. It actually started with him asking me a question about a contract that he received from an iBuyer. Evidently, his mother had clicked on some link of We Buy Homes Now or We Buy Condos Now, and he asked me to review that contract, which I did. And I was actually kind of surprised because the number that they were willing to pay in cash instantly, to my surprise, it was actually market value or damn close to it. Best I could tell, at least from what he sent me, there didn't seem to be any exorbitant charges. But full disclosure, this was the early stages of them talking, and this was a very preliminary sheet that I was reviewing. But at least on paper, from what I saw, the number they were offering was almost exactly what I thought the condo should trade at. But yet to be determined because, again, it was early in the process. And without reviewing a net sheet or more contracts, I don't really know what all the other charges are going to be. But on paper, it looked pretty good, which is probably a long way of getting to. There are investors in the market that are willing to pay market rates right now in order to capitalize on increasing rents in the future. And make no mistake, there are tons of institutional buyers waiting for the opportunity to go out there and take advantage of increasing rents. But who knows? Maybe the rental market will crash too. Yet to be determined. I don't know. But what I do know is the question that my friend asked me, which it took me forever to get to. And I read your comments. I know some of you think I talk too much before I ever get to a point. The point is Ron DeSantis. He was asking me about Ron DeSantis. My friend asked me, what did I think would happen to Florida if Ron DeSantis ran for president and became president of the United States? Now, I know my friend pretty well, so I kind of had a feeling that I already knew what he thought, and I also had a feeling that he already knew what I thought, but But given that none of you know what either of us think, I figure I should go on the record right now. So if Ron DeSantis runs for president and gets elected, would I be happy about that for the state of Florida? No, I would not be a big fan of that. I absolutely do not want to lose him as governor. And I also think that if he was to be elected president, he might have the fortitude to bring some of the changes and some of the strength and some of the freedom that he deployed in Florida to the rest of the country. Now, I've been doing tons of content here recently talking about what I suspect will happen in the future as the pain of recession continues to increase and what my predictions are for the housing market. And in almost all of those videos, the thing that I talk about being the linchpin that could undermine everything is employment. Because if people don't have jobs, or if people take significant pay cuts and they're living way above their means, but now they're living way above their means with far less income or no income, well, then chances are at some point we're going to have a scenario where the economic pain caused by recession will lead to forced sales or distressed sales. And maybe it won't lead to distressed or forced sales, but if everyone is feeling the same economic pain right around the same time, then what you will have is a tremendous supply of homes for sale. And if there is a tremendous amount of supply of homes for sale, well, then it's an extreme buyer's market, which means a buyer is going to negotiate the best price and the best terms for themselves, which is going to be significantly less than it would be if the dynamics were the other way around, like what we saw last year. But I'm going to do my best to stay on point here because right now we're focusing on unemployment. And CPI numbers came out last week. The Fed talked. They raised the Fed funds rate by 50 basis points. They talked about remaining hawkish into the future, which the market didn't like. But what the Fed also indicated, what Jerome Powell also indicated, that employment numbers are not where he wants them to be. The squeeze that he's putting on the market and the economy is meant to, in some form or fashion, reduce the employment numbers, which is exactly what happened in the past with Paul Volcker. He jacked up interest rates, unemployment went through the roof, and we were looking at a massive recession. And we might be in store for that too, yet to be determined. But for now, employment on paper looks strong. Now, I believe that's all window dressing, but at the end of the day, on paper, employment is higher than what the Fed wants it to be. But that's Jerome Powell. And we're talking about DeSantis right now. And so I'm not going to make him president just yet. I'm going to keep him in the spot that he's in, which for today, thank God, is governor of the state of Florida. And when the pandemic was at its worst and people were locked down and everyone was terrified, one of the main reasons that people wanted to move to Florida was due to the fact that Florida remained open and was free. And that was primarily due to Governor Ron DeSantis, or should I say, Realtor of the Year, Ron DeSantis. But that was then, and this is now. And now most places are pretty much wide open. Not everywhere, but Florida certainly is. And I share that because the strength of the Florida economy is one of the main reasons why people continue to still want to live in Florida. I'm going to pop this in so you can read it, but this is essentially a counter to the video that I did talking about the CPI numbers. This is dated December 16th, and I'm just reading it. Job growth rate exceeds the nation's for the 20th consecutive month. DeSantis announced that Florida's unemployment rate dropped to 2.6%, the lowest among the nation's top 10 largest states and 1.1% lower than the nation's. And this has been consistent for the last 2 years. And so it is 100% factually true that if people lose their jobs and they can't afford their lifestyle and they can't afford their house, that there are certainly going to be an economic hardship that they face. But with DeSantis in office, that's far less likely to happen because Florida private sector employment increased by over 28,000 jobs last month. And Florida employers have added jobs for 31 consecutive months. And here's why. Florida's continued success over the past 2 years is no accident. No matter the challenges, we've stayed on offense. Florida's economy is outpacing the nation for the second consecutive year because we have invested in our workforce and prioritized keeping Floridians at work and businesses open. And as the new year approaches, we will continue investing in our workforce and infrastructure to create jobs and keep our economy moving forward. And that's a quote from Ron DeSantis himself, which brings me back to where I started, which is the question of, is unemployment a ticking time bomb? And the answer is, in some places, probably. But in Florida, doubtful. Now, I hope you found this content valuable, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, share it with a friend, have a Merry Christmas, and until next time, peace!